The wind came first, wild and senseless, flinging grit against the windows like handfuls of angry rice. It had arrived unannounced, a bitter wind riding low off the prairie, carrying the dry, scorched scent of distant lightning and the slow, rising ache of pressure that made bones hum. Miriam Cole had known it was coming. The ache had woken her before the storm had even touched the horizon, a deep tugging in her hips and fingers, the same dull warning that used to signal her son's fevers long before the thermometer did. That morning, she had moved through her home like someone preparing for a visitation. Not frantic, not afraid, just methodical. She latched the shutters, folded the towels, set a basin of water by the stove, brought in the last of the clothes from the line, the linen snapping like sails behind her as she pulled them free of the pins. There had been no surprise in the thunder's approach, only the old certainty that something would find her again. It always did. By the time the rain began, heavy and sudden as if a great pitcher had tipped in the sky, Miriam had already lit 2 lamps. The power had flickered once, then gone entirely, the farmhouse sighing into its silence. It had once been a bright house, built in a time when light had felt like a given thing. Caleb had run down its hallway with paper airplanes and skin knees, leaving behind the sound of his laughter and muddy footprints that had once made her exasperated and now made her chest feel hollow with want. The photographs above the mantel hadn't shifted, but they looked different in stormlight, grayer, more severe. Caleb at age 7, missing a tooth. Caleb holding a jar of fireflies. Caleb in his navy work coat just before he left for Alberta. The corners of his mouth lifted in a hesitant, adult smile he'd only just begun to wear. She did not look at them long. Instead, Miriam stood by the stove, counting the seconds between lightning and thunder out of habit, the way she had once counted spoons or stitches or the rhythm of Caleb's breath when he had pneumonia at 11 and his skin had burned with a heat she couldn't draw out. Her hands moved without her asking, slicing turnips, stirring broth, setting out 2 mugs though only one was needed. Some habits had never left her, even after his death. Even after the funeral that felt like it took place beneath a sky permanently turned to ash. Even after 5 years of silence in the guest room. The rain had not yet begun to seep beneath the porch door when she heard it. The sound of fists, not knocking, not asking, but pounding. Frantic, ragged, human. For a moment, she stood still. Not from fear, but from that strange hesitation that overtakes people who have grown used to long silences, when the world outside finally speaks. The storm made it difficult to separate the rhythm of the knocks from the wind, but there was no mistaking it. Someone was at her door. She reached for the small hatchet she kept near the woodpile, an old habit that came more from widowhood than wisdom, then pulled open a heavy front door with her weight leaned into it. The figure collapsed inward. She caught only impressions at first, the weight of another body, soaked through and trembling, the smell of wet wool and mud and something else, something sharp and almost metallic that made her think of blood or fear. The woman, because it was a woman, had a hand pressed to the doorframe as she slid in, her knees folding as if the porch had been the only thing keeping her upright. Her coat was mottled with leaves and twigs, and one of her boots was missing. Water dripped from her sleeves and pooled instantly on the wood floor, but Miriam did not ask questions. She moved the way she did when tending an injured animal, careful and quiet, as if sound itself might startle the stranger away. Together, without words, they made it to Sati. The woman, young, barely out of girlhood, though hardship had deepened the shadows beneath her eyes, collapsed into the cushions with a sound not quite a sob and not quite a sigh. Miriam fetched a quilt from the back of the rocking chair and wrapped it around her, feeling how cold the girl had become. Her fingers were mottled blue at the knuckles. Her lips trembled even as she tried to speak. "Please," she whispered, "just a little while. I didn't know where else." "Quiet now," Miriam murmured, kneeling beside her. She pressed her hand to the girl's shoulder, not to restrain but to anchor her. "You're here. That's enough." The girl nodded once, eyes fluttering closed like a child who had run too far. Miriam saw then what the coat had hidden, the curve of a belly, heavy and undeniable beneath soaked layers. The young woman was at least 7 months along, maybe more. She was far from home, wherever that was, and very nearly frozen. No one walked into a storm like that unless they had no other choice. No one knocked on the doors of strangers, unless whatever they left behind was more frightening than the unknown ahead. Miriam stood slowly, her knees protesting the way they always did when rain settled in the air. She moved to the stove and poured the last of the water into a basin, soaking a cloth and wringing out before pressing it to the girl's face. The warmth drew a shuddering breath. After a few minutes, Miriam lifted one of the mugs of broth, held it steady while the girl drank, her hands too weak to manage it herself. They said nothing for a long time. There were no questions, just warmth slowly finding its way back into the room. It wasn't until the lightning slowed, stretching out in long, distant flashes, that the girl finally opened her eyes and looked at Miriam fully. There was gratitude there, yes, but also something else. A searching, a familiarity that didn't make sense. I walked all day, the girl said hoarsely. Didn't know where I was going. But then I saw your light. I saw the porch. It looked like a place I'd been before, even though I never have. Miriam nodded but did not answer. She knew about things that pulled you in without explanation, about the way certain winds carried more than weather. The girl coughed then, sudden and wet, and Miriam helped her sit up, brushing damp strands of hair back from her temple. She had a delicate, heart-shaped face, hollow cheeks, pale lashes, but her voice, when she murmured again, carried something else. I thought I heard a baby crying, she said, just before I knocked. Miriam froze. The room did not. The rain ticked on, steady against the windows, and the kettle hissed where it had been forgotten. There was no baby in this house. There had not been one in decades. And yet the girl looked at her with clear, wide eyes, as if she had not spoken nonsense at all. You didn't, Miriam replied, voice low, guarded. There's no child here. Oh, the girl whispered, blinking slowly. That's strange. I could have sworn. She didn't finish. Her head lolled slightly, exhaustion pulling her under, and Miriam eased her back into the pillows. As she stood, she glanced toward the old hallway, the one that led to Caleb's room, now kept closed but never emptied. The girl had said she'd seen the light, had followed it, had heard something that wasn't there. Miriam moved back toward the door to secure it, feeling the wind now only in traces, brushing faintly beneath the wood slats. The storm had passed, or it had simply stepped aside, making room for something heavier. In the reflection of the window, blurred by rain and candlelight, Miriam thought, only for a moment, that she saw Caleb standing behind her, just outside the frame, watching quietly the way he used to when he came home late, and didn't want to wake her. But when she turned, of course, there was nothing, only the soft sound of the girl's breathing behind her and the strange echo of her words. I thought I heard a baby crying. Miriam shivered, but not from cold. She moved back to the living room, adjusted the wick on the lamp, and sat in the chair closest to the girl. Her eyes remained open, fixed on the shadows. She had always believed that the dead stayed gone, but something about the girl's arrival felt different, like a door had been left cracked open, like a voice had called across the spaces between things, and someone, against all odds, had answered. By morning, the storm had lessened into a slow, sullen drizzle, as though the sky itself were weary now, ashamed of fury it had loosed the night before. The air inside the farmhouse carried the musty dampness of soaked earth and cooling ash, and Miriam Cole, who had slept only in fits and starts, moved through her kitchen like a woman resuming an unfinished conversation. The stranger still slept, curled beneath the faded star quilt that had once covered Caleb's bed. Miriam had chosen it from the hall closet without thinking, her hands guided by a memory she hadn't touched in years. She'd forgotten how soft it had become from age and laundering, how the threads at the edges had frayed into silk-like fringes. Now, in the daylight that filtered through cloud-heavy windows, she could see how tightly the girl clutched its corner, as if it were a rope anchoring her to shore. Miriam poured water from the stovetop kettle into the chip blue basin she kept by the sink, watching the steam rise in slow, sighing curls. She had always believed that morning light told the truth more plainly than night ever could. The house felt changed somehow, unsettled not just by the storm but by the presence of the girl sleeping in her sitting room. Eva, she had finally said, though nothing more. No surname, No town of origin, no explanation. Just Eva. And that name had come with a voice that trembled not from cold, but from the edges of something far older. It wasn't fear that Miriam had sensed in her. It was endurance. That quiet, strained kind of courage that only surfaced in people who would run out of roads and found themselves at the mercy of strangers. The girl stirred just as Miriam laid out a clean towel beside the basin. Her movements were slow, uncertain, the kind that belonged to someone not yet convinced they were safe. When their eyes met, there was a flicker of shame in Eva's, as though waking in another woman's home was an admission of failure rather than survival. "I didn't mean to sleep so long," she whispered, her voice still hoarse from cold and fatigue. "You needed it," Miriam replied simply. "Your body's been through worse than sleep." Eva sat upright, grimacing slightly as she shifted her weight. The baby moved then, a subtle ripple beneath her dress, and her hands went to her stomach with the reflex of someone who had grown used to worry as a second skin. Miriam watched her, quietly assessing the girl's pallor, the shadows under her eyes, the dryness in her lips. She needed more than rest. She needed weeks of care, time, reassurance. Miriam, who had once believed herself too hollowed out by grief to give any of those things again, felt something stir in her chest. Not warmth exactly, but kind of watchfulness that bordered on the maternal despite herself. "I've made tea," she said, gesturing to the small table by the window. "It's not fancy. Chamomile and mint from the garden, dried last summer. You'll need it to warm your blood." Eva nodded and followed her with cautious steps, glancing occasionally at the photos on the mantel but not asking about them. Miriam noticed this detail. People often asked, strangers especially. There was something about those images that drew questions the way a gravestone with fresh flowers might. But Eva said nothing. She moved instead to the table, lowering herself carefully into the wooden chair, as if she were unsure the house wouldn't shift beneath her. They drank the tea in silence for a while, the sound of rain threading softly through the silence like background music. Miriam had left the window cracked just enough to let in the scent of wet earth and lilacs, their branches drooping against the porch railings, saturated and sagging, but still intact. The storm had not taken them. That mattered to her more than she could say. "I didn't think I'd make it through the night," Eva said finally, her fingers tracing the edge of the teacup. "There was a stretch of road where the wind knocked me off my feet. I lost my boot. I thought that was it. But then I saw your light, like a lantern in the fog." Miriam didn't respond right away. She felt something catch in her throat. Not quite emotion, not quite disbelief. It was the way Eva said it, as if the house itself had been waiting, as if it had been part of some larger arrangement that neither of them could name. "This house has always held on longer than it should," Miriam murmured at last. "It's stubborn, like the people who built it." Eva offered a faint smile, but her eyes remained tired, burdened. She turned slightly toward the window and then, as if remembering something, hummed a short melody under her breath. Miriam's cup froze halfway to her lips. The sound was barely there, more breath than note, but unmistakable. It was a lullaby Caleb had loved, the one she used to sing when his earaches kept him from sleeping, the one he'd asked her to hum once more, even as a grown man, the night before he left for Alberta. She hadn't heard that tune in years, hadn't dared play it even on the old phonograph tucked away in the attic. Her pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. "Where did you hear that song?" she asked, quieter than she intended. Eva blinked, surprised. "Oh, I don't know. I guess I must have heard it when I was small. I hum it when I'm nervous. I didn't mean—" "No, it's all right." Miriam set her cup down carefully, steadying herself. "It just took me by surprise, is all." Eva shifted in her chair and looked out the window again, her expression distant, almost unreadable. Miriam wondered then whether Eva truly remembered where she had learned the song, or if it surfaced from someplace deeper, from a vault of dreams and ancestral echoes where certain melodies traveled untethered through time. They finished their tea slowly. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped, leaving only a gentle mist that clung to the glass like a breath. Miriam stood to clear the cups, moving with a deliberateness that had become her armor in the years since Caleb's death. She had learned how to survive the hollow days by keeping her hands busy. Stillness was dangerous. Stillness allowed memory to flood back in. As she turned to rinse the mugs, she noticed the condensation fogging the kitchen window. Without thinking, she reached out and drew her finger across the pane, tracing the name she had written 100 times in journals and grocery lists and prayer books. Caleb. She didn't mean to do it. The gesture was instinctive, like a whisper in the dark. But when she turned back, she saw Eva watching her. "You wrote his name," Eva said gently, without judgment. "Yes," Miriam replied, not bothering to lie. Eva hesitated. "Was he your son?" Miriam nodded. "He was." "I'm sorry." Miriam's hands clenched slightly around the rim of the sink. She didn't want sympathy. She didn't want the tidy kindness of a stranger who couldn't understand what it meant to outlive your own child. And yet something in Eva's voice rang differently. Not pity, but reverence. Like someone who had also carried the weight of grief and knew not to speak its name too loudly. "I lost someone too," Eva said quietly. "Not the same, but the ache feels familiar." Miriam looked at her then, really looked, not just as a girl soaked and frightened and swollen with life, but as someone marked by something unspoken. There were depths to her sorrow, edges she hadn't revealed yet. Miriam sensed it, and perhaps, against her better judgment, she wanted to know more. "We all carry ghosts," Miriam said, "but some come home with names." Eva looked down at her hands, her fingers interlaced over the rise of her belly. The silence between them shifted, deepened. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the porch like a stray thought. Miriam turned back to the stove and lit another burner. Not because she needed more heat, but because the flicker of the flame felt like something she could still control. Behind her, Eva began to hum again, softer this time, as if singing not to the room but to the child inside her. And Miriam, though she did not say aloud, felt something stir again, some ancient, painful hope that had once belonged only to her and Caleb, and now hovered quietly between her and this girl with a stranger's face and a lullaby on her lips. The storm had not taken everything. Not yet. There was something unfinished in the air, something unsaid, and soon, one way or another, it would ask to be known. The morning after the rain finally ended, the sky opened into a pale, washed-out blue, as though the storm had rinsed it clean. The earth outside steamed gently, releasing the smell of wet soil and uprooted weeds into the air, and the soft gurgle of the creek beyond the orchard was fuller, more urgent, pulsing with runoff and debris. Inside the farmhouse, the world returned to itself in small ways. The kettle sang on the stove, the floorboards creaked beneath familiar weight, and the windows gathered light without the flicker of lightning behind them. Yet something within the house had shifted, subtly but undeniably. Miriam felt in the way her footsteps echoed differently against the wood, as if the house, like her, was beginning to accommodate a second presence not entirely its own. Eva had been quieter that morning, though not from illness or strain. There was a stillness in her that Miriam recognized from her own reflection years ago, the silence of someone holding something tightly within, not out of shame, but out of necessity. Miriam didn't press. She had learned the hard way that some truths bloomed only when the soil was left undisturbed. Instead, she had taken out the rye flour in a chip bowl, set it on the long kitchen counter, and begun preparing bread. It was a kind of ritual, half prayer and half muscle memory. The act of combining water, salt, yeast, and flour into something that could hold warmth. When Eva wandered into the kitchen, one hand beneath her belly and the other brushing sleep from her eyes, Miriam simply gestured to the dough, wordlessly inviting her into the rhythm. They worked side by side at the counter, sleeves rolled up, fingers coated in flour. The smell of yeast was thick in the room, mingling with smoke and the faint hint of lavender soap. Miriam guided Eva's hands through motions, fold, press, turn, repeat, until the dough began to change texture beneath their palms, softening into the kind of smooth resistance that promised rise. The work was grounding. Eva did not speak at first, but her shoulders began to settle, the tension uncoiling slowly as her hands moved. There was something ancient in the way they stood there, two women shaping bread together in a quiet house, their griefs unspoken but not hidden. "I used to bake with my grandmother," Eva said eventually, her voice faint, like she wasn't sure if it belonged in the room. "She taught me to make sweet rolls. Honey and lemon peel." It was the only time I ever saw her smile like she meant it. Miriam didn't look up, but she nodded. Food remembers us long after we forget ourselves. I still make Caleb's favorite stew every first frost. He used to say the cinnamon made it taste like October. Eva glanced sideways at her. He sounded like he was kind. He was, Miriam said, pressing the dough harder now. Too kind for some of the places he ended up. Eva didn't answer, but something in her eyes flickered. Her hands hesitated over the dough, then resumed. Miriam knew that look. She had seen it in herself, in mirrors and spoons and the surface of dishwater. It was the face of someone who had held kindness once and watched it vanish. They set the dough in a bowl to rise and covered it with a damp cloth, then sat near the hearth while it rested. Miriam stirred the embers to life and added a new log. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light onto the worn rug beneath their feet. A crow called outside from the fence post. The world was rebuilding its noise again. I was engaged, Eva said, almost abruptly. His name was Daniel. We were going to be married in June. He worked in a copper mine about 4 towns over. Long shifts, deep earth. He died there. Roof collapse. Miriam's chest tightened at the word, not from surprise, but from the inevitability of it. Loss had its own scent, and she had smelled it on Eva from the moment she stepped across the threshold. I'm sorry, she said, not out of obligation, but because she meant it. He wasn't supposed to be on shift that day, Eva continued, staring into the fire. He switched with a friend who had a sick child, said he wanted the weekend off so we could paint the nursery together. We just rented a cottage near the school. It had lilacs growing wild out front. Miriam listened without interrupting. She could feel the way Eva's voice was trying not to shake, holding itself firm like the last board in a broken fence. She remembered that feeling well, the need to say a name out loud before it faded into abstraction, the need to claim the love that had once been real. When he died, Eva said, the people in my church told me it was a punishment, that the child was a curse because we weren't married yet. They said I'd shame my family, that I should leave quietly and not come back. Miriam turned to look at her then. The girl wasn't crying. Her face was dry, hard, pale with the stillness of someone who had moved beyond tears. Miriam didn't speak for a moment. Then she reached into the small basket beside the hearth and pulled out a tin of sea salt. Salt's older than judgment, she said. We use it to keep bread from spoiling. Maybe it works on people too. Eva let out a breath that might have been laughter, though it ended in a sharp exhale, like she was trying to keep from unraveling. Miriam handed her the salt tin, and they returned to the dough, punching it down together and shaping it into loaves. Their fingers worked silently now, no longer strangers, but not yet something defined. Just 2 people surviving beneath the same roof. When the bread was in the oven and the smell began to bloom, warm, rich, almost sacred, Miriam poured them each a second cup of tea. The kitchen was dim now, the light low and honey-colored. Eva looked up at her again, eyes searching. I haven't decided what I'll name the baby, she said quietly. I've thought about it, but it never feels right when I say the names out loud, like they don't belong to him. Miriam hesitated. Then she stood and crossed the side table beneath the window, where a narrow wooden box sat unopened. She had not touched it in 5 years, not even to dust. She lifted the lid slowly and removed the small silver spoon that Caleb had been given at birth, his initials, CHC, engraved into the handle. She set it gently on the table between them. My son's name was Caleb, she said. He died in a logging accident up north. He was 28. Eva's gaze dropped to the spoon, her hand still around her teacup. I'm not saying you have to name him after anyone, Miriam continued, her voice calm but low. Only that names carry weight. And sometimes we don't choose them. Sometimes they arrive on the wind. Eva nodded, slowly. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something waiting. Outside, the sky had darkened again, not with storm but with evening. The last golden light spread like softened butter across the kitchen floor, and for a moment, the house felt suspended in it. I keep hearing it in my dreams, Eva said suddenly, as though confessing something she'd been holding back. A voice calling the name Caleb. Not shouting, just calling, like someone looking for a child. Miriam sat down again. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. The wind had begun to rise outside, just enough to rattle the porch swing. The fire popped on the hearth, casting shadows against the walls. In the stillness, the name hung between them, unclaimed but undeniable. And upstairs, buried in dust and cedar and memory, a boy's toolbox waited beneath a quilt and attic. The attic door stuck at first, swollen by rain and time, the wood reluctant to release its grip on the frame. Miriam leaned her shoulder into it and gave a soft grunt, more muscle than frustration, until the latch gave way with a tired click. The narrow stairs creaked beneath her weight, announcing each step like the toll of a distant bell. She hadn't climbed them in over 2 years. The air inside was still, tinged with old cedar and the faintest trace of mildew. Light bled in from a small round window near the peak of the roof, and in it, dust floated in great drifting galaxies, stirred by the motion of her arrival. Everything here was as she had left it. Boxes labeled in faded marker, a cradle draped with a moth-eaten sheet, an old oil lamp resting beside a bundle of newspaper clippings tied in twine. This had been Caleb's world once. His boyhood headquarters, his quiet refuge when the house below became too loud with grief or arguments or the restlessness that seemed to stalk him even as a child. She moved carefully, brushing cobwebs from her path as she crossed to the far side where the toolbox rested beneath a faded tarp. The shape of it was unmistakable, carved from maple and sanded smooth by Caleb's own hands the summer he turned 16. He'd built it to hold his tools when he started working weekends with a carpenter in town. Too proud to use the battered red metal box Miriam had offered, he'd spent hours sanding the corners, oiling the hinges, etching his initials into the underside of the lid with the point of a wood-burning pen. It had traveled with him when he left for the logging camp, packed among his meager belongings, and returned home only after the accident, the handle stained and one corner chipped from the impact that took his life. Miriam knelt and lifted the lid slowly, her breath catching as the faint scent of engine oil and pine sap rose to meet her. Everything inside remained untouched, an old measuring tape neatly coiled, a wrench with the paint worn smooth from use, a folded scrap of paper with rough pencil markings she didn't unfold. She ran her fingers across the wood inside the lid, feeling the indentation of his name, shallow but sure, Caleb H. Cole. She sat there for several minutes, the hush of the attic pressing in close, her palm resting flat against the wood, as if she could warm it back to life. Downstairs, she could hear Eva moving to the kitchen, dishes clinking gently, the rhythm of sweeping. The girl had offered to clean without being asked, her voice shy but certain, and Miriam had allowed it, not because she needed the help, but because it felt right to let her shape the space with her own hands, to lay a quiet claim to the place that had taken her in. Miriam gathered the toolbox and rose carefully, tucking it beneath her arm. On the way down the stairs, she paused only once, turning her head as if she expected to see Caleb at the top landing, his lanky form leaning against the wall, that crooked grin playing on his lips. But the space was empty, as it always had been. Back in the kitchen, Eva looked up from the sink, her eyes flicking to the box in Miriam's hands. "I thought I heard you up there," she said. "I didn't want to intrude." Miriam set the box on the table, brushing sawdust from the lid. "You weren't. I just needed to find something." Eva approached slowly, her gaze caught by the toolbox, like a bird drawn to a glint of light. She reached out, then paused. "May I?" Miriam nodded. Eva lifted the lid with a kind of reverence, as though opening a reliquary. She studied the contents without touching them, her face unreadable but softened. "It still smells like him," Miriam said quietly. "Cedar and oil. He always kept it clean, even after work. Said it was disrespectful to let rust eat what served you." Eva smiled faintly, her fingers grazing the edge of the measuring tape. "Daniel said almost the same thing. He was like that too, careful with tools. Said they were an extension of your intentions." There was something in the way she said it, firm, clear, shaped by memory, that made Miriam turn. Eva was staring down at the box, but her posture had changed, shoulders drawn inward slightly, as though resisting some emotion that had surfaced too quickly. "I keep thinking about the names," Eva said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yours, his, Mine, how they keep repeating, circling back." Miriam didn't reply, but she felt it too. The strange patterns that had begun to emerge. The way Eva had arrived without direction, yet somehow landed here. The song she hummed without knowing its origin. And now, the way she spoke of tools and intentions with a vocabulary too familiar for chance. "Can I show you something?" Miriam asked. Eva nodded. Miriam crossed to the side drawer beneath the spice cabinet and pulled out Caleb's old watch. It was a simple piece, tarnished along the rim, the leather strap weathered and cracked with age. She hadn't worn it in years, not since the day she received a call that his body had been found under a collapsed timber wall, breathless and crushed before he had time to cry out. She handed it to Eva without explanation. Eva took it gently, turning it over in her palm. Her eyes widened slightly as she read the inscription on the back. "To Caleb, may you always find your way. He got it the day he left for the logging camp," Miriam said, her voice caught somewhere between pride and sorrow. "I wanted him to have something from home, something that ticked, even when everything else stood still." Eva's fingers hovered over the engraving, then closed around the watch as though protecting it. "My Daniel had a compass like this," she said softly. "Said it wasn't about direction. It was about anchoring, knowing you were somewhere, that you existed." The two women sat in silence for a long time, the kitchen filled with the scent of wood smoke and distant lilac. The afternoon sun had begun to slant across the windowsill, catching dust in slow-moving spirals. Miriam watched Eva cradle the watch against her stomach, her thumb moving gently along its edge, the way one might comfort an infant. Then something subtle changed in the girl's posture. Her head turned slightly toward the hall, her breath pausing for just a moment, eyes focused on something not entirely present. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Miriam froze. "Hear what?" "A door," Eva whispered. "Or maybe footsteps. Upstairs." Miriam turned her head. The house was still. The attic door remained shut, its latch secure, the air around them thick with heat and silence. She opened her mouth to reply when she felt it too, an old shift in the air, a stirring she had no words for. It wasn't sound exactly. More presence, as though someone had walked just beyond the room and left their breath in the walls. "I've felt that before," Miriam murmured, "when I walked past his room." Eva looked down at the watch again. "Maybe it's not gone," she said. "Maybe some part of them lingers, waiting for the right moment to be seen." Miriam's hands curled gently into her lap. She didn't want to believe in ghosts. She had buried her son. She had folded his clothes, scrubbed the last of his scent from the collar of his coat, packed away every object that carried the weight of him. She had learned how to be alone in a house that once sang with his voice. But now with Eva here, with her belly heavy with life, with her words and memories echoing the shape of her own, something was unraveling, or perhaps mending. "I think I need to show you the garden," Miriam said after a pause, her voice steadier now. "There's something I planted that never bloomed, not in 5 years. But last night, I dreamed it had opened." Eva raised her eyes, and they held each other's gaze for a long, quiet second. Neither of them spoke, but something passed between them, an understanding, an ache, a fragile thread of belonging not yet named. Outside, the wind rustled the orchard leaves. The lilacs bent slightly toward the porch, as though listening. And somewhere deep beneath the house, the roots began to stir. The morning after the bread cooled and the name Caleb settled into the corners of the kitchen like the last note of a hymn, the house felt different. Not lighter, not yet, but looser, as if the long, tense muscles of its wooden frame had begun to breathe again. The wind had quieted to a whisper in the grass, and the light came in without wariness, casting long, golden fingers across the worn boards of the hallway and the sun-bleached patchwork of the sitting room rug. Miriam rose early, out of habit more than necessity, and found herself pausing at the doorway of the spare bedroom, Caleb's old room, though she hadn't called it that aloud in years. She did not open the door, but she stood there, fingertips grazing the faded frame, as though listening for something on the other side of the wood. Downstairs, Eva was already awake, sitting on the porch steps with a shawl over her shoulders and a slice of rye bread resting in her palm like communion. She didn't say good morning when Miriam joined her. She just nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon where the mist was lifting slowly from the fields, revealing the furrows of tilled earth and the skeletal remains of last season's corn stalks. It had the quiet dignity of a painting, the way the land held its lines and shadows, the stillness before spring's insistence made everything green again. Miriam eased herself down beside her, the old porch groaning beneath them in a familiar protest that somehow didn't bother her that day. The silence between them was long, but not uncomfortable. Miriam had always believed that silence, if allowed to live and breathe, became a kind of language. They sat that way for nearly an hour, passing the bread between them, sharing the last of the soft butter she'd made in the fall. The baby kicked once, visibly, beneath Eva's shawl, and both women looked down at the movement as if it were a third presence, asking to be remembered. Eventually, Eva spoke, her voice low and even. "I dreamt him again last night." Miriam didn't ask who. She already knew. He wasn't speaking this time, just walking through a field. Same one every time. He has something in his hand, like a bird, or maybe it's a glove, and he keeps looking over his shoulder, like he's waiting for someone. Miriam stared out over the field. Caleb used to do that, walk with his head turned, always checking to see if I was still watching, even when he was small. I think he was afraid of disappearing. Eva nodded slowly. In the dream, there's always this feeling like I'm too far away to reach him. I try to call out, but my voice doesn't work. It's like trying to speak underwater. I used to have dreams like that, Miriam said. The year after he died, I'd wake up with his name in my mouth, but it never felt like mine anymore, like I didn't have the right to say it. Eva looked over at her then, searching her face not for comfort, but for permission. "Why do you think he's in my dreams?" she asked. "Why me?" Miriam didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and stepped off the porch, walking slowly toward the cedar railing where Caleb had once carved his initials. The wood was weathered now, splintered and silver gray with age, but the shapes were still there, CHC, with a small arrow through a heart beneath them. She ran her fingers across the groove. "Sometimes," she said, not turning back, "the dead come looking for witnesses, people who will hold their names when the rest of the world lets go." Eva's eyes followed her. "But I didn't know him." "Maybe not in the way we think of knowing," Miriam replied. "But names don't always need memory. Sometimes they just need a place to land." She turned then, looking directly at the girl. Eva's face was pale in the soft light, but her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before, a kind of reckoning. Miriam could see it. The way her grip on her own story had shifted, not looser, but no longer clenched. She had begun to open. They spent the late morning raking the front yard, pulling up wind-blown branches and clusters of sodden leaves that the storm had plastered against the side of the house. The work was slow, paced at Eva's breath and the gentle curve of her growing belly. Miriam didn't rush her. There was something holy in the pace of that morning. The scrape of the rake, the hush of the wind in the chimney, the way the world seemed to be listening. By midday, the sun was high enough to cast real warmth, and they shed their shawls, sleeves rolled up as they leaned their tools against the barn and sat on the back stoop with mason jars of cool water between their hands. It was then that Eva spoke again, unprompted. "I used to think the baby would never make it, not because of anything medical, just because I didn't think I deserved to keep something that good." Miriam glanced at her. "Who told you that?" Eva didn't answer for a moment. Then she shook her head. "Everyone, and no one. You hear enough ways. It starts to sound like truth." Miriam took a long drink, feeling the cold slide down her throat. The world isn't always kind to mothers who start in grief, but it doesn't mean you don't have the right to joy. Eva looked away, but Miriam saw her blinking fast, jaw clenched. The tears didn't fall. They just sat there, brimming at the edges like a storm waiting to decide whether it would rain again. That evening, after supper, Miriam led her up the attic steps. She hadn't been up there in more than a year. Dust floated in the air like ash, and the heat clung to the low ceiling beams, thick and dry. The room smelled of cedar and old paper, oil from forgotten lamp, the faintest trace of liniment from a time when pain was soothed with friction and herbs instead of pharmaceuticals. At the far end of the attic, Beneath the slanted roofline sat a wooden chest. She opened it without ceremony. Inside, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was Caleb's toolbox. It was heavy, not just from the tools inside, but from everything it symbolized. The scent hit her first, metal and cedar and something faintly smoky. She could remember the day he built it, hands calloused from work, trying to convince her he was grown. He was 17. Thought the world would make room for his tenderness. Thought being useful would keep him safe. She lifted the lid and ran her fingers across the handles. Pliers a level, an old chisel worn smooth with use. Eva stepped closer, reverently, her hands clasped over her belly. Miriam set the box down gently on a nearby crate. "I thought you might want to sit," she said. "Feet up." This lid's solid oak. Caleb always said it was a seat before it was a box. Eva sank down slowly, and when she placed her feet atop the lid, something in her expression shifted. She looked down and saw the initials carved there, tiny and faint, hidden in a corner. CHC. "He carved this too?" she asked, her voice hushed. Miriam nodded. Everything he made, he marked, said it was his way of not being forgotten. Eva rested her palms along the box, breathing slowly. "He won't be," she whispered. "Not now." And for a moment, there was no attic, no grief, no years lost between them. Just a mother, a child unborn, and the ghost of a boy who had once carved his name into the world with a hope that someone, somewhere, would still be watching. Downstairs, the wind had begun to rise again, not hard but insistent, rustling the birch leaves beside the house. Miriam looked toward the attic window, cracked slightly open, and saw the porch swing rocking gently below. She could hear it now. The sound of footsteps, long vanished, returning in memory or something stranger. And in the growing quiet of the house, the air carried a sense that someone, was still walking the path between then and now. The day began with wind again, though this time it did not carry threat, but memory. It stirred the curtains in the sitting room and rattled the birch trees beside the porch like old bones remembering music. Miriam stood at the kitchen sink, peeling apples for a pie she hadn't planned to bake, listening absently to the leaves tapping against the glass. Her hands worked with the same slow precision they always did, but her mind had drifted somewhere else, to the attic, to the wooden box, and the initials carved into it, to the way Eva looked at that toolbox like it wasn't just a relic but a signal, something placed in her path on purpose. The girl had not spoken much since then. She had retreated into a thoughtful stillness, her movements quiet, her face unreadable except in the rare moments she let herself hum again. Miriam heard it sometimes, the lullaby floating down the stairs or slipping through the hallway like steam. Caleb's song, reshaped by a voice that didn't belong to the past yet somehow carried it. Later that morning, while the crust baked and the smell of cinnamon thickened the air, Miriam entered her bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She hadn't touched its contents in years. It still creaked in protest when the lid lifted. Inside lay the letters, rubber banded into bundles by month and year. Their envelopes yellowed, corners curling like dead petals. Most were from friends long past, a few from her late husband, one or two from her sister, before she disappeared into her own kind of silence. But near the bottom, in a separate bundle, were Caleb's letters. Only a handful. He had never been one for writing. He preferred phone calls, laughter on the line, voice thick with sawdust and wind. But when the days stretched too long or the work left him lonely, he had sent these. Plain envelopes, each addressed in the same earnest handwriting, each sealed with more hope than words could contain. She took the last one, unopened. She knew it by heart, not from reading but from avoiding it. The final postmark before the accident. It had arrived 3 days after she got the call from the foreman, still smudged with dirt and bearing the faint scent of pine. She had held it then, sat with it for hours, unable to tear it open. It had lived in the chest ever since, untouched, a kind of wound she wasn't ready to clean. Now, with her hands trembling and her heart oddly steady, she carried it into the kitchen where Eva sat reading an old seed catalog at the table, her fingers absently circling the rim of a glass of milk. "I need to read you something," Miriam said, and without waiting for permission, she sat across from her, laid the envelope between them, and opened it. The letter unfolded with a gentle crackle. like the exhale of something long buried. Miriam cleared her throat, steadied her breath, and began to read aloud. Caleb's voice filled the room. Not his real voice, but the cadence of it, the shape of him forming again in the spaces between words. "Ma," she read. "I know it's been a while since I wrote. Sorry about that. Things have been strange out here. Not bad, just different. It's quiet a lot of the time, which you know I don't mind. But sometimes it's the kind of quiet that feels like waiting, like something's supposed to happen and hasn't yet." Miriam glanced up. Eva's eyes were fixed on the page. Her lips parted slightly. She said nothing, so Miriam continued. "There's this guy I've been working with. His name's Daniel. Real steady. Lost his wife a few years ago when she gave birth. The baby didn't make it either. I didn't ask for details. You can see it in his eyes, though. He carries it. We don't talk about much, but we drink coffee together before the shift and sometimes after. He told me once that pain gets quieter if you don't wrestle with it. Just let it sit beside you. I think he's right." Miriam paused again. Eva's hands had moved to her stomach, her fingers spreading wide like she was shielding something sacred. "Anyway," she read on, "I've been thinking about the future more than I expected. Don't laugh, but I've been thinking about names. If I ever have a boy, I think I'd name him Daniel. Not for me, for the kind of man who walks through loss and doesn't let it rot him. I think there's something noble in that. I want to pass that down." The room fell still. The wind outside had stilled, as if it, too, were listening. "That's the end," Miriam said softly, folding the letter along its creases and laying it flat on the table. "It was the last thing he wrote to me." Eva did not speak. She stared down at the folded letter. Her breath quickened, shallow. Then, in a voice that barely carried, she said, "I didn't tell you before. I didn't know how. But that's what I've already named him. The baby. His name will be Daniel. I didn't choose it for my fiancé. I thought I did, but now I don't know. Maybe it came from somewhere else." Miriam didn't respond immediately. She simply let the silence stretch between them, feeling the weight of coincidence bend into something more precise. Not fate. She didn't believe in neat stories. But this was something deeper, a kind of echo stitched through time. It made her chest ache with a pressure she hadn't felt since she buried her son. Not grief, not entirely, but something shaped like grief, softened by astonishment. Eva wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. "He used to say that if anything ever happened to him, he wanted me to find a place where the baby would be known, not just fed or clothed or pitted, but known, seen. I didn't know what that meant until now." Miriam looked at her, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself do before. She saw the cracks in her, the strength threaded through weariness, the love still growing in spite of all the loss it had sprouted from. And she saw her son, not in the features of Eva's face or the shape of her child, but in the thread that bound them here, in this house, on this land, in this moment neither one had chosen. "I don't have much left," Miriam said. "No more children, no husband, just this land and this house, and a few good years still in my bones. But if you want to stay until he's born or longer, I won't ask questions. You don't have to explain anything. You're already here. That's enough." Eva's mouth trembled, but she nodded. Her voice came in a whisper. "I want him to know where he comes from." Miriam reached across the table and placed her hand gently over Eva's. The gesture was small, but it felt enormous, like placing a stone on a cairn that marked the end of a long, wandering road. Outside, the clouds shifted and a sudden patch of light spilled across the floor, catching on the edge of the letter and the rim of the teacup beside it. Somewhere in the orchard, a bird called out, clear, bright, startling. Miriam stood and moved to the sink, where the pie had cooled and the wind had returned, brushing against the windows like a breath, just enough to unsettle the curtains and make them dance again. Something was coming. Not sorrow this time, not loss, but something that would test them still. Something that required their names to be spoken aloud and their strength to be reclaimed. It began with a sound like nothing Miriam had ever quite heard before, low, steady and deep, like the groan of the earth shifting its weight. She was outside at the time, bent at the waist, her hands deep in a tangle of early weeds at the base of the garden fence. when she first noticed a change. The sun had disappeared, tucked behind a wall of slate-colored clouds that had not been there an hour earlier. The wind, too, had altered. Not the crisp, brief gust of spring, but a strange, sticky stillness that sat on the skin like breath. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her gloves, and looked out across the pasture. In the distance, the creek had risen. She could see the shimmer of it now where it shouldn't be, spilling past its usual banks, pooling into the low basin that fed into the cellar slope. A knot formed at the base of her neck, tight and sudden. They had been lucky so far. The storm earlier that week had come and gone without too much damage. The soil had held. But this was different. The ground was too saturated, too full. All it would take was one more surge, one more slow draining hour, and the lower part of the house would be underwater. She dropped the gloves and went inside, boots thudding against the floorboards as she passed through the kitchen. Eva was upstairs resting, the kind of deep nap that comes only to the very pregnant, her body finally surrendering to the weight it carried. Miriam didn't call for her. Not yet. She didn't want to raise alarm without reason. Instead, she moved through the hallway and unlatched the narrow door that led down to the cellar. The air that rose up was cold and wet, tinged with the unmistakable sourness of standing water. She closed her eyes, listening. Beneath the creak of the steps and the whir of the wind beyond the windows, she could hear it, the soft, persistent lapping of water meeting stone. She descended quickly, holding the rail with both hands. Halfway down, she saw it. The lowest steps were already dark with moisture. Crates of canned tomatoes and pickled beans floated in slow circles, the tops of their lids clinking gently. Jars had overturned. Shelves had begun to lean. She stepped carefully into the shallow edge, wincing as cold flooded her boots, and tried to lift what she could, moving jars, pulling sacks of dry goods onto higher ground. The light bulb overhead flickered, then steadied again, casting her shadow long across the far wall. It felt as if the house were tilting, groaning under the pressure of too much memory, too much weather. Behind her, she heard a voice. Miriam? It was soft, groggy, uncertain. She turned to see Eve at the top of the stairs, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the railing. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "You shouldn't be up," Miriam said, more sharply than she intended. "Go sit down. I'll handle this." But Eva didn't move. She stared past Miriam into the cellar, eyes locked on the water. "It's rising fast," she whispered. "Faster than it should." Miriam opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She didn't know how Eva knew, but she felt it too, that strange urgency in the air, the sense that something was shifting beneath their feet, beneath their stories. She nodded once, turned, and began hauling what she could toward the steps. The flood had no rage to it, no roar. It came instead like grief, steady, weighty, indifferent. It rose not to destroy, but to remind. They worked in silence. Miriam handed up jars and tools, bags of potatoes, and a heavy old chest of linens she hadn't opened in years. Eva took them slowly, carefully, her breath shortening with each trip. Miriam tried not to look too closely at her face, but the girl was straining, her lips tight, one hand pressed protectively beneath her ribs. "We need to stop," Miriam said finally. "That's enough. You're too far along. You need to lie down." But Eva shook her head, stubborn. "We're not finished." And then, suddenly, she bent forward with a sharp cry, clutching her belly. Miriam froze. The sound was not a grunt of effort. It was a sound with depth, with finality. A sound that came from the beginning of something. Was that? Miriam stepped forward, heart surging. "Eva, is it the baby?" Eva was breathing hard, nodding, trying to speak. "I think it's starting. The cramp started this morning, but I thought it was just strain. I didn't want to say anything." Another contraction hit, and she gripped the stair railing with white-knuckle force. Miriam sprang into motion, guiding her back up, one arm around her shoulders, the other beneath her elbow. The water in the cellar had reached the 5th step. They made it to the sitting room, where Miriam cleared the couch, laid down blankets, propped pillows. She sent Eva to lie down and fetch towels, boiled water, found the old notebook of birthing notes she copied from a midwife in town decades ago. It was worn, the edges soft, but the pages were still legible. Her hands shook as she read, but her mind was calm. There was no time for fear. The storm had come, not as wind or thunder this time, but as labor. Eva lay on her side, sweat beading along her brow, her breaths uneven. The contractions were close now, minutes apart. The baby was ready, or the world was. Outside, the rain returned, not fierce, but steady, drumming softly against the windows, its rhythm syncing with the rise and fall of Eva's pain. Miriam sat beside her, wiping her forehead, whispering comfort not in words, but in tone, in presence. She remembered what it had been like when Caleb was born. The fear and joy braided together, the sense that everything in the world had narrowed down to this one small moment. The hours passed. The fire burned low. The lights flickered once, then steadied. The cellar below continued to fill, but Miriam no longer cared. Everything that mattered was in this room now, in this breath, in this push, in this labor that was as much about letting go as it was about bringing forth. She coached Eva through it, counted each contraction, gripped her hand as if tethering them both to the world. And then, near midnight, in a room filled with the scent of rain and steam and blood, a cry rang out. Not loud, not sharp, but insistent, real. Miriam caught the baby in her hands, slippery and red and alive. A boy. His limbs flailed against the cold air, his mouth opened wide, and the sound that came from him shattered something inside her that had been locked away for years. She wrapped him quickly, placed him on Eva's chest. The girl was crying now, her face radiant with exhaustion and disbelief. Her fingers curled around the infant's back like they were learning him by touch. "Daniel," she whispered. "Daniel Caleb." Miriam sat back on her heels, pressing her palms to her chest. It ached, not with pain, but with return, with presence, with the strange, impossible way time folds on itself. She had helped bring a child into the world again, in the very house where she had once raised one, where she had once mourned one, and something in the house seemed to know it, seemed to settle. The wind had quieted, the rain slowed, the cellar would dry eventually, the jars could be replaced. But this boy was new, and yet not new, a continuation, a thread woven back into the cloth of her life, a name given again, not to reclaim the past, but to welcome the future. Miriam stood, slowly, carefully, and placed another log on the fire. She turned to Eva and the child, both now sleeping, curled together like one body split in two. Outside, the ground was saturated, the trees heavy with moisture. But beneath the porch, beneath the windows, beneath the storm-laced sky, a soft crocus had opened, pale and trembling, blooming despite everything. And in the quiet that followed, Miriam heard it, the low creak of Caleb's old bedroom door, shifting on its hinges in the hallway, as though someone had just stepped out. Miriam had forgotten how quiet a house became in the hours after birth, not the quiet of emptiness or waiting, but the hush that follows something sacred, the kind of silence that wraps itself around wood and breath and time like a quilt made of years. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world rinsed and glistening. Water still dripped from the eaves, forming tiny rivers to the garden beds. But the sky had cleared to a gray blush blue, a morning sky that seemed incapable of remembering how dark the night had been. Inside, the only sound was the tick of the old mantel clock and the soft, irregular whimpering of the newborn boy sleeping against Eva's chest. Miriam stood in the doorway of the sitting room, holding a fresh cloth diaper in one hand, the scent of boiled linen rising faintly into her nose. She didn't move to hand it over yet. She simply watched, Eva curled in the crook of the couch, her hair damp and unbrushed, her arms forming a loose circle around the swaddled child, who lay tucked beneath her chin like something placed there by nature, by instinct. The light through the window caught on the boy's fine, dark hair, and for the first time, Miriam saw clearly the line of Caleb's jaw and the angle of his newborn face. It struck her not with sadness, but with a kind of ache that was richer than pain, a fullness, something like having forgotten the lyrics to a song, and then suddenly remembering every word. "He hasn't cried much," Eva whispered without turning her head. Her voice was hoarse, worn raw from hours of labor and weeping. Some don't, Miriam said. Some babies come into the world listening. Eva stroked the boy's back with her thumb. Is that what you think he's doing? I think, Miriam answered softly. He knows where he is. That helps. Eva turned her head then, her face drawn and pale, but her eyes clear. I thought I'd be more afraid. That after everything, I'd be terrified to hold him, or to look at him and feel nothing. But he's mine. I can feel it, like my heart just moved. Miriam walked across the room, crouched beside the couch, and passed her the clean cloth. That's how it should feel. They stayed like that for a long while. No talk of plans, no need for ceremony. The birth had redrawn the walls of the house, softened its hard corners. The furniture felt warmer now. The rugs looked brighter. Even the air seemed to carry the faintest note of sweetness, as if years of dust and grief had been swept out during the storm. Miriam had felt this once before, after Caleb was born, when she'd lain in bed holding him, the morning sun brushing his face through the lace curtains, the world pausing long enough for her to memorize it. Now she was seeing it again, not through her own motherhood, but through this fragile, unspeakable bond that formed between her and Eva, the kind of tether that grows only out of shared loss and reborn love. Later, when the baby was fed and sleeping in the cradle, Miriam had unearthed from the attic the week before a small pine thing with hand-carved birds etched along the rim. Eva stood at the kitchen sink, her hair pulled back loosely, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Miriam protested once, gently, telling her to rest, but Eva only smiled and said, I need to feel useful again. I need to touch water and plates and remember what it's like to clean something I can finish. So Miriam let her. She sat at the table, peeling carrots, and let the sounds of domesticity wash over her. The splash of water, the creak of the drying rack, the steady rhythm of someone putting the world back in order after it had been remade. It was in these moments, the ones that might have seemed ordinary from the outside, that Miriam felt the deepest shift. It wasn't just that Eva had brought life into the house. It was that she had brought movement, intention, the quiet dignity of someone refusing to vanish. After lunch, Miriam carried the baby upstairs so Eva could rest. She cradled him in the crook of her arm as she walked the hallway, passing the closed door to Caleb's old room, and then turned into the room where the sun fell directly across the bed. She had made up the space with clean linens and an open window, letting the scent of lilac and wet dirt drift in with the light. She sat in the old rocker in the corner, the same one she had used to feed Caleb, and settled the baby against her shoulder. He did not cry. He blinked slow and dreamily, and then closed his eyes again. She rocked him in silence, letting the movement lull them both into that quiet middle place where memory and presence fold together. She thought of Caleb as a baby. How serious his eyes had been even then, how he had stared at her like he was trying to solve a puzzle. She remembered the first time he smiled, the day he lost his first tooth, the night he came down the stairs at age 11 holding his notebook, tears on his cheeks because he couldn't finish a poem he'd been writing. She had held him then too, though he pretended not to need it. She had held him through every heartbreak, every growing pain, every goodbye. Now she held this boy, Daniel Caleb, and felt as though the circle had not closed but deepened. When Eva woke near dusk, Miriam brought her upstairs. They sat together on the edge of the bed, while Daniel slept between them, a small swaddled bundle with one fist curled against his cheek. The room was warm, golden with fading sun. Outside, the sky had turned the color of barley and pale wine. I keep thinking about how I got here, Eva said suddenly. How impossible it is that I ended up on your porch. I walked for days, Miriam, through miles of land that all looked the same. I could have turned 100 different directions, but I didn't. You saw a light, Miriam said. That's what you told me. I did, Eva whispered, but I think it was more than a lamp in a window. I think he brought me here. Miriam didn't ask who. She only placed her hand over Eva's and let the weight of those words settle between them. The idea didn't frighten her. It didn't even surprise her. She had begun in the quiet of those nights before the birth to believe that something larger than grief had been moving through their lives, something more persistent than memory, more deliberate than coincidence. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, Eva continued, but I think I believe in callings, in being drawn. Miriam nodded. I think the dead call us home in the ways they know how. Maybe your Daniel did that. Maybe my Caleb. Maybe both. They said nothing for a long while after that. Just sat, their hands joined over the baby's sleeping form. The room dimmed. A moth tapped softly against the window pane. Somewhere below, the porch swing creaked, shifting with the breeze. Miriam thought then of the day they'd buried Caleb. How the wind had blown through the cemetery like a breath from another life. How she had felt, even in her despair, that something of him had not gone entirely. That something was waiting. Now, as darkness pressed in gently from the corners of the room and the baby stirred in his sleep, Miriam felt it again, not waiting but watching. The kind of presence that doesn't speak or move, but lingers. A witness. A keeper of the thread that ties beginnings to endings and endings back to beginnings. Something in the walls seemed to sigh, as if finally at ease. Downstairs, the hearth had gone cold. The house was ready for fire again. And tomorrow, when the morning light returned and the land began to dry, there would be work to do. Fences to mend, laundry to wash, a garden to replant. Life had come back to the house. Not with fanfare or noise, but with breath, blood, and a name whispered twice. The days after Daniel's birth moved with the pace of something sacred and unhurried, as if time itself had softened its edges for their sake. Morning light came early now, gold lace and tender, spilling across the kitchen floor like a hush. The land beyond the windows began to take on the early shades of summer, greener stalks rising from soaked soil, lilacs flaring into bloom with their powdery purple clusters, and the fields, once drowned in spring's fury, now breathing under the blue sky like animals just waking from hibernation. Inside the farmhouse, the world rearranged itself quietly around the presence of the newborn. Shoes were taken off at the door. Voices lowered unconsciously near the cradle. Meals were smaller, simpler. The air smelled of milk and chamomile and wood smoke in the evenings, as though the past had decided to stay close but no longer intrude. Eva moved through these days like someone gently relearning her body. Her steps were slower, her hands still tentative, but there was something in her face that hadn't been there before, a steadiness that rose with each feeding, each diaper change, each lullaby murmur beneath her breath in the middle of the night. She no longer hummed only to soothe herself. Her voice belonged now to a listener. Daniel responded to it, eyes searching the air each time she spoke, his head turning toward the sound like a compass drawn to magnetic north. In those quiet hours, Miriam often watched him from the hallway, unseen, remembering the weight of Caleb's head against her own chest, the feel of his breath against her skin when he slept tucked in the crook of her arm. Time had frayed those details in her memory, worn them like fabric, but watching Eva with Daniel had brought them back. Not in dreams, but in the texture of waking life. The cradle Caleb had carved remained beside the fireplace, close enough to warmth, but far enough from the bustle of the kitchen. It bore its years with grace. The carvings along the rim had faded, smoothed down by countless small hands in the rub of cloth, but the shape held firm, as though it had waited all this time to be useful again. Miriam had lined it with Caleb's baby quilt, a faded cotton piece stitched in soft greens and yellows, the edges worn but intact. When she laid Daniel into it for the first time, she'd press one hand gently over his chest and whispered, not a prayer exactly, but something like a promise. She didn't speak it aloud. She didn't need to. The promise was in the act itself, in the offering of that cradle, in the return of something once lost to a future she had never expected to witness. One morning, nearly 2 weeks after the birth, Eva found Miriam on the porch mending an old chair cushion. The wicker seat had split in the storm, and Miriam had taken it as a small project, something her hands could do while her mind drifted. The baby was asleep in the sling across Eva's front, and she moved carefully, still adjusting to the new distribution of her weight. But her voice was sure when she spoke. "I'd like to stay," she said, "through the summer, maybe longer." Miriam didn't look up at first. She tied off a strand of thread and tucked it neatly into the woven seam. Then she raised her eyes and studied Eva's face, still pale in places, still thin by fatigue, but now carrying a layer of resolve. The girl who had arrived on her porch during the storm was not the woman who stood there now. "I don't have much to offer," Miriam said, setting the cushion aside. Just this house and the land. A few good tools. Some quiet. It's not a life for everyone. It's enough, Eva said. It's more than I've had in a long time. Miriam nodded slowly, and that was all. They didn't speak of it again, but from that day forward, the rhythm of the house changed. Eva began helping with the garden in the cooler parts of the morning. Her sleeves rolled and her hair pulled back. Daniel wrapped close against her chest. Miriam taught her how to prune the orchard, how to check the fence post for signs of wear, how to read the sky for changes in the wind. They worked side by side, not talking much, the kind of work where hands speak louder than voices. In the afternoons, Miriam would rock Daniel on the porch while Eva rested, the two women trading the weight of the child back and forth without question or need for permission. Sometimes, when the boys slept, Eva would sit alone by the old cedar railing and trace her fingers over the initials Caleb had carved decades earlier. The arrow through the heart, faded but still clear, caught her attention most. She would study it, the way a person studies a handwriting of someone they've never met but whose story they carry. Miriam noticed her doing it once and said nothing, only placed a hand on her shoulder as she passed. The gesture said everything. As June deepened, the trees thickened their canopies and the smell of cut grass became a constant. The soil dried, cracked in places, but Miriam knew it wouldn't last. Summer storms were just behind the horizon. Still, there was time now. Time to teach Eva how to preserve berries, how to sterilize jars and tuck them neatly into the rebuilt cellar shelves. Time to show her where the wild mint grew by the river bend, how to keep spiders from the corn rows without chemicals. They moved through the land as if returning to something ancient, something that belonged to neither of them alone but both of them together now. On the first Sunday of July, they carried Daniel down to the creek and sat beneath the low branches of the willow that Caleb had planted when he was 13. The tree had grown wide, its limbs sweeping toward the water like arms always in search of someone to hold. Miriam brought a small wooden bowl filled with water and mint leaves, and Eva, holding her child with both hands, dipped her fingers into the bowl and whispered the name again, Daniel Caleb. Her voice did not break. It did not falter. She said it like a mother claiming her child before the sky, the earth, and the memory of all who had come before. Miriam watched with a stillness that came not from attachment, but from awe. She thought again of the letter Caleb had sent. The last one, the way his words had woven the name into being before the boy ever existed. She thought of how that name had passed through paper, through silence, through storm and sleep and grief, only to land here, now, in the arms of this girl who had found her way not through directions, but through something older, something nameless. As the sun dipped low, casting long amber streaks across the water, Eva turned to Miriam and asked, "Would you be his godmother?" The question caught her like a gust to the chest. She hadn't expected it, though perhaps she should have. Miriam swallowed, then nodded. Yes, I would. They did not speak of legacy or blood. They didn't need to. The boy bore two names, each one passed down by men who had once loved women, who loved them back in silence and strength. But it was the women who carried the memory now, who kept it lit like a candle sheltered from the wind. That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep and the house had gone quiet, Miriam slipped into the spare room and pulled the old diary from a shelf. She hadn't written in it since a year after Caleb died. The pages were yellowed at the edges, and the binding had begun to crack. She opened to the first blank page, picked up her pen and wrote, "Asterisk, a boy named after the lost has been born into the hands of the found. I am not his grandmother by blood, but today, Eva asked if I would be his godmother. I did not expect to feel this again, the pull toward meaning, the quiet swell of belonging. I think Caleb would have seen her too, the way I do, not as a shadow of something we once had, but as a light returned in a different shape, a door open where there was once only a wall. She is staying. They both are. The house no longer feels like a monument. It feels like a home, asterisk." She closed the book, pressed her hand flat against the cover, and exhaled. Outside, the wind was changing, not fiercely, but insistently, carrying the scent of ripening wheat, of riverbank clay, of something not yet arrived but moving closer. By late August, the fields had turned the color of old gold. The wheat, tall and bowed, rippled in slow waves under the breath of a lazy wind, while the sun hung low in the sky even before the dinner hour, casting long shadows that stretched across the porch and slid through the windows like soft fingers. The heat no longer pressed in the way it had in July. It eased back each night, allowing the earth to cool, as if the land itself understood that something had shifted. An old season passing, a new one waiting not at the edge of the calendar, but inside the house that now held 3 hearts instead of 1. Miriam stood in the kitchen, slicing peaches into thin, neat crescents, her movements slow and careful. Her hands had begun to ache more in the mornings, a stiffness that took longer to shake off. But she didn't mind it. The ache reminded her she was still part of the doing, still inside the life being built around her. She watched the juice gather at the base of the cutting board, soaking into the wood. The fruit was from the old tree out near the fence line, the one that had nearly gone bitter from neglect, but somehow, this year, yielded sweet things again. Outside, Eva knelt by the new fence row with Daniel strapped snugly across her chest, his small head nestled beneath the shade of her sun hat. She moved slowly but with purpose, pressing saplings into the damp earth, dogwood, hawthorn, 2 pear trees that Miriam had once ordered but never planted. The fence was not meant to keep anything out. It wasn't tall enough for that. It was a border of intention, a line drawn not in protection but in promise, as if the land itself needed to know they were staying, that they meant to root something here that would last longer than the sorrow that brought them. Miriam brought out a pitcher of water and 2 chipped glasses, setting them down on the porch railing. Eva looked up, wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, and smiled. It was a kind of smile that no longer had grief underneath it, the kind that rose up from something quieter, acceptance maybe, or peace, or just a slow pleasure doing something good with your hands. Daniel stirred in the sling, but didn't cry. He was content to be near her heartbeat, to live tucked inside the rhythms of their small, shared world. They drank in the shade and spoke in easy tones about the crops, about the canning schedule for September, about whether the creek would dry early this year. Miriam mentioned the old smokehouse, how it needed cleaning before the frost, and Eva said she'd take a look at it after the weekend. These were not urgent things. They were the kind of tasks that made up the spine of a steady life. And Miriam, who had once feared there would never again be a woman beside her to share that list, found herself grateful each time Eva added her voice to planning. In the evenings, they ate on the porch when the weather allowed, Daniel cradling the basket at their feet, a small quilt folded beneath him. He had begun to smile, not just from gas or reflex, but real smiles, gummy and wide, the kind that broke Miriam open in a way she hadn't known was still possible. He liked the sound of the rocking chair, the whistle of the kettle, the low drone of Miriam reading aloud from her garden books, the ones with faded ink and pressed ferns tucked between pages. He liked light too, always turning his head toward it as though it belonged to him. Sometimes, when Eva stepped away into the bath or to the clothesline, Miriam would pick him up and carry him around the house, narrating the history of each room, each window pane, each drawer. "This is where your Uncle Caleb kept his carving knives." She'd whisper, "This beam here, he scratched his height into it every year on his birthday. That stain on the hallway rug, he spilled blackberry jam when he was 6 and tried to clean it before I saw." Daniel wouldn't understand, of course, but she said it anyway. She spoke his father's name to him like a litany, a lullaby reshaped. The house absorbed it, seemed to welcome it, the way dry wood welcomes oil. As summer tipped slowly toward its end, they began preparing for the colder months. Firewood was stacked beneath the awning. Eva stitched a new lining for Cradle. Miriam mended the hole in her wool coat. They ordered flour, lard, and oats from the feed store. And one morning, Eva brought home a chick from the neighbor's hen house, a scrawny thing with lopsided feathers and a sharp beak, and declared they were going to raise hens again. Miriam had laughed, really laughed, a full sound she hadn't heard from her own mouth in years. The chick, startled, darted under the table. Daniel cooed from the sling, and Miriam, without thinking, reached to steady him. Later that afternoon, as the light turned amber and the wind picked up from the west, Miriam stood in the doorway of Caleb's old room. The door was open now. It had been for some time. They used it as a nursery during the day. Not every day, but often enough. She cleaned it out weeks ago, aired the mattress, polished the wooden floor, dusted the bookshelves that still held Caleb's old collection of field guides and novels with pages worn thin at the corners. She hadn't gotten rid of anything, just shifted the arrangement, made space. On the wall beside the window, she'd hung a small photograph, not one of Caleb, but of Daniel. His tiny fingers curled into a fist, his eyes open and wide, looking past the camera towards something unseen. She'd taken on a quiet morning while Eva slept. The boy had been awake, blinking slowly in the cradle, and the light had struck his face in a way that stopped her breath. She hadn't planned to frame it, but when she held the photo in her hand, she'd felt something settle inside her, like a lock finally catching its groove. She stepped into the room now, the wood cool beneath her feet, and picked up one of Caleb's old carved birds from the shelf. It was a small sparrow, tail chipped but otherwise intact. She ran her thumb along the curve of its wing. Outside, the wind shifted again, lifting the scent of ripe grass and distant rain. Behind her, she heard Eva's voice, soft, warm, calling from the kitchen that dinner was ready. And beneath it, Daniel's cry, brief, insistent, already full of will. Miriam smiled and returned the bird to its place. She stood for a moment longer, taking the room, the light, the stillness, and then turned to go. They ate together that evening by lamplight, the windows open to the cooling air. Afterward, Eva stood with Daniel in her arms, swaying slightly as she stared out across the darkening fields. "Do you think he'll stay here when he grows up?" she asked quietly. Miriam didn't answer right away. She looked at the child's face, so full of possibility, of mystery, and then passed them both to the land she had tended for decades, the land that had taken her son and now, somehow, returned him in ways she could not have imagined. "I don't know," she said at last, "but I think he'll always know where to return." Eva nodded. Her eyes were shining, though not from sadness, just fullness, gratitude, love. Later, after the baby was asleep and the kitchen cleaned, Miriam stepped out onto the porch alone. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like seeds. The swing creaked gently in the breeze. Somewhere out in the pasture, an owl called once, then fell silent. She sat down, pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders, and let the cool air rise to her face. She thought of all the years that had passed, all the names spoken in this house, all the stories that had unfolded and folded again like linen tucked away in drawers. She thought of the night Eva had arrived, soaked and trembling, and the moment she'd heard the lullaby spill from her mouth. She thought of the letter from Caleb, of the final sentence that had never been finished, and how somehow, through storm and silence, the words had found their way here. She placed her hand over her heart. It beat steady and slow. Beneath her skin, grief still lived, but no longer alone. It had made room for something else, for a presence, for legacy, for love that came back, not in the shape she remembered, but in the one she needed. Inside, a child was sleeping in a cradle built by hands now buried in the land. A mother was humming in a kitchen lit by oil lamp. A life was being lived, not again, but still. And in the hush of that harvest dusk, Miriam whispered thank you to the wind, not expecting an answer, only sending it back.